Ma'am, for the last time, either you take your seat in the back of the aircraft, or I will have federal officers drag you off this plane in restraints." The pilot's voice, amplified by the cabin intercom, was a cudgel designed to bludgeon her into submission. It hammered through the quiet murmur of the first-class cabin, and every eye turned to the woman in the grease-stained navy coveralls standing stubbornly in the aisle. Dr. Aris Thorne did not raise her voice. She did not flail or protest. She simply planted her steel-toed boots more firmly on the plush carpet, her gaze fixed on the smirking, imperious man in seat 2B, Senator Alastair Finch. She then lifted her eyes to meet the hostile glare of Captain Mallory, who stood framed in the cockpit doorway. "Captain," she said, her voice low but carrying the resonant calm of absolute certainty, "you are making a catastrophic error." A laugh, sharp and mocking, erupted from the senator. "Oh, I think the catastrophic error was the ground crew letting their mechanics wander onto the plane to bother the passengers. They thought she was a nobody, a piece of grit in the finely tuned machine of their important lives. They saw the smudges of hydraulic fluid on her cheek and the exhaustion in her eyes and drew a simple, damning conclusion. They didn't know that the woman they were about to assault wasn't just a mechanic. She was the architect of the very soul of this aircraft, the creator of the $7 billion Ethereum engine monitoring system that kept their entire fleet from falling out of the sky. And they had just given her a reason to turn it off. The recycled air of global Voyager Airlines Flight 710 from Seattle to Washington, D.C. was thick with the scent of entitlement and stale coffee. For Aris, it was supposed to be the final leg of a 72-hour marathon. She hadn't been in a boardroom. She'd been on her back on a cold hangar floor at the Boeing assembly plant, personally supervising the final integration of her company's new predictive maintenance suite on the next generation of Dreamliners. It was a landmark achievement, a system so advanced it could detect a microscopic fracture in a turbine blade weeks before it became a threat. It was the kind of work that truly mattered, the kind that saved lives. Now all she wanted was 6 hours of quiet. She wasn't even supposed to be in first class. Her company's travel policy, which she had written herself, mandated coach for all employees, including the CEO. But the flight was overbooked, and a sympathetic gate agent, seeing the Ethereum Dynamics Priority Engineering badge still clipped to her coveralls, had bumped her up as a professional courtesy. "You guys keep these birds flying," the agent had said with a wink. "Least we can do." She had found her seat, 1A, a bulkhead window with precious legroom, and was about to sink into it when she felt it. A subtle, high-frequency vibration thrumming up through the soles of her boots. It was almost imperceptible, a faint tremor that 999 out of 1,000 people would have dismissed as a quirk of the jet bridge connection. But to Aris, it was a scream. Her entire life's work was the interpretation of such screams. She paused, closing her eyes, letting her senses analyze the data. It wasn't the APU, it wasn't the ground power unit. It was coming from engine number 2, the starboard engine. It was the signature of a harmonic resonance imbalance in the primary compressor stage. A 1 in a million flaw in a brand new engine. Not dangerous yet, but a clear violation of go-live protocols. She turned to the nearest flight attendant, a man whose name tag read Kyle and whose smile was stretched to the breaking point. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "You need to have the captain alert ground control. There's a resonance imbalance in the starboard engine. They need to run a full diagnostic before takeoff." Kyle's smile faltered. He looked her up and down, taking in the worn coveralls and the grime under her fingernails. "Ma'am, the engines are fine. Our pilots are the best in the world. Please take your seat." "I'm not questioning the pilot," Aris insisted, keeping her voice level. "I'm questioning the hardware. The frequency is 15.2 kilohertz. That's indicative of a potential stator vane misalignment. It's a minor issue now, but at cruising altitude, it could propagate stress fractures." She was speaking a language he didn't understand, and it made him angry. "Ma'am, if you don't take your seat, I'll have to call the captain." "Please do," Aris said. "He'll want to know." That's when Senator Finch had decided to intervene. He had been conducting a loud phone call about budget appropriations, his voice booming with the self-importance of a man who had never been told no. He lowered his phone, his face a mask of theatrical irritation. "What is the problem here?" he demanded, not of Aris, but of Kyle. "This flight is already 20 minutes behind schedule. I have a critical vote on the Senate floor this evening. Is this person holding us up?" "She's making claims about the engine, Senator," Kyle said, his voice dropping into a sycophantic murmur. "Some sort of mechanic, I think." Finch finally deigned to look at Aris, his eyes sweeping over her with a disgust so profound it was almost comical. "My dear woman," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I sit on the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation. I can assure you that if there were a problem with this aircraft, I would know about it. Now you are clearly overwrought and out of your depth. Go back to the galley or wherever it is you belong and let the professionals do their jobs." Aris felt a cold stillness settle over her. She had faced down 4-star generals in the Pentagon and hostile venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. She was not easily intimidated. "With all due respect, Senator, your position on a subcommittee doesn't make you an aerospace engineer. I am. And I am telling you, this plane is not cleared for flight under its own operational parameters." The senator's face turned a dangerous shade of plum. He saw his authority being challenged by a woman he had already categorized as insignificant. It was an intolerable affront. He snapped his fingers at Kyle. "This woman is a security risk. She's delusional, possibly intoxicated. She's attempting to sabotage a federal official's travel. Get the captain. I want her removed from this aircraft immediately." Kyle scurried away like a frightened rabbit. A moment later, Captain Mallory appeared. He was a man in his late 50s with a military-style haircut and an air of weary arrogance. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seek clarification. He took one look at the powerful senator, nodding toward the woman in the dirty coveralls, and made a calculation based on power, not safety. "Ma'am," Mallory said, his voice flat and devoid of curiosity, "I'm told you're causing a disturbance." "Captain," Aris said, making one last attempt at reason. "I am Dr. Aris Thorne, CEO of Ethereum Dynamics. My company designed the monitoring systems on this plane. I am telling you, as the lead engineer of that system, that Engine 2 is flagging a Level 1 maintenance alert." Mallory actually laughed. It was a short, sharp bark. "Ethereum, right. And I'm Neil Armstrong. Look, lady, I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living, but Senator Finch has requested your removal. You can walk off, or you can be carried off. Your choice." And that was the moment the world pivoted. Aris looked from the captain's dismissive face to the senator's smug sneer. They weren't just ignoring a warning. They were punishing the messenger because they disliked her appearance. The injustice of it was a physical blow. She knew what would happen next. She had seen the videos. But she also knew exactly what she had built. Ethereum wasn't just a piece of software. It was a digital fortress, and she held every key. "You will regret this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a threat. It was a diagnosis. "Is that a threat?" Captain Mallory snapped, seizing the opportunity. "She's threatening the flight crew. Get the Port Authority police, now." The cabin fell into a hushed, horrified silence. A young man in row 5 discreetly raised his phone and began to record. Aris didn't resist when the 2 officers arrived. One was older, with tired eyes that had seen it all. The other was young, eager, his hand already resting on his sidearm. His name tag read, Novak. "Where's the problem?" Novak asked, his eyes scanning the cabin for a threat. "Right here," the senator said, pointing a manicured finger at Aris. "This woman, belligerent, making threats, mentally unstable, a clear and present danger to this flight." Novak didn't hesitate. He didn't ask Aris for her side of the story. He saw a United States senator and a pilot, both pointing at a woman in dirty clothes. The math was simple. "Ma'am, let's go," he said, grabbing her arm. His grip was like a vice. "Do not touch me," Aris said, her voice dropping to an icy calm, but she flinched from the sudden pain. "Resisting," Novak shouted as if to a crowd. It was a performance. He wrenched her arm behind her back in a move designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. A sharp, grinding agony shot through her shoulder as her rotator cuff tore. A cry of pure pain escaped her lips, a sound that was quickly muffled as Novak shoved her forward, forcing her head down. She was frog-marched down the narrow aisle. As they passed Senator Finch, he leaned in, his voice a triumphant hiss. "Have a nice walk, sweetheart. Some people just don't know their place." They shoved her out onto the jet bridge, the sudden chill of the Seattle air a shock against her flushed skin. The metal of the handcuffs was cold and unforgiving as they bit into her wrists. As they hauled her up the ramp toward the terminal, Aris's mind was a whirlwind of cold, clear thought. The pain in her shoulder was a distant signal. The humiliation was a resource to be weaponized. She wasn't thinking about lawyers or lawsuits. That was the old way. She was thinking about Protocol 7. It was a fail-safe she had personally coded into the Ethereum mainframe, a dead man's switch of sorts. The system was integrated into every aspect of the airline's operations. If a registered Ethereum-cleared engineer, particularly a Level 10 administrator like herself, was ever involuntarily flagged as a security threat within a client's network, as she had just been by Captain Mallory at the behest of Senator Finch, the system was designed to interpret it as a hostile infiltration, a cyber attack in progress. Its automatic, unoverridable response was to protect its core function, the safety of the fleet. It would sever all data connections, quarantine all operational systems, and ground every single aircraft until the threat could be manually and physically verified by Ethereum command. They were marching her toward a holding cell. They thought they were caging an animal. They had no idea they had just locked themselves out of their own house. The holding cell in the airport substation was a sterile box of cinder block and regret. It smelled of antiseptic and stale fear. Officer Novak shoved her onto the concrete bench and slammed the heavy steel door, the sound a definitive metallic clang of finality. "You have the right to remain silent," Novak recited from the other side of the small barred window, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "We'll get you processed in a few hours, once we figure out who you really are." "I told you who I am," Aris said, her voice steady despite the fire raging in her shoulder. She cradled her arm, the pain a nauseating pulsing wave. "Yeah, the CEO of Ether whatever," Novak scoffed. "Sure you are. And I'm the King of England. Sit tight, Jane Doe." His footsteps receded down the hall, leaving her in a profound and ringing silence. She closed her eyes, not in despair, but in focus. She ran a systems check on her own body. Shoulder, severe damage, likely a full rotator cuff tear. Wrists, bruised. Dignity, wounded but intact. Resolve, forged into something harder than steel. They had taken her phone, her wallet, her ID badge. They had stripped her of every external signifier of her identity. It was their fatal mistake. They had left her with her mind. And her watch. It was a simple, rugged-looking digital field watch, a model she favored for its durability when she was working in the hangars. To a casual observer, it was a $20 piece of plastic. In reality, it was a custom-built encrypted communication device linked to a private satellite network. She pressed the bezel in a specific sequence. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. Morse code for I, incursion. The screen flickered for a nanosecond, displaying a microscopic Ethereum logo before returning to the time. It was done. The signal was sent, not to the police, not to 911, but to one man. Benjamin Carter, General Counsel for Ethereum Dynamics. Ben wasn't a pit bull, he was a python. He didn't bark or tear, he calmly and methodically squeezed his opponents until they had no air left, no options, no hope. He was a man who preferred de-escalation and carefully worded contracts. But Aris knew that beneath his placid professorial exterior was a loyalty to her that was absolute. While she waited for the python to stir, the world outside her concrete box was beginning to fracture. The video, shot by the student in row 5, was now on Twitter. The caption was simple: "A global voyager and Senator Alastair Finch. Sen Finch, have a passenger, an engineer who warned about a safety issue, assaulted and arrested. This is insane. Jakarta Flight 710, Jakarta Global Voyager." At 3:10 p.m., the video had 1,200 views. By 3:25 p.m., after being retweeted by a popular aviation journalist, it had 200,000. By 3:40 p.m., it was the #1 trending topic in the United States. The internet, a vast and slumbering beast, had been prodded awake. Simultaneously, at the Global Voyager Airlines Operational Command Center in Dallas, a symphony of chaos was erupting. A junior technician was the first to see it. A single red line of code appeared on the main diagnostic board. Protocol 7 initiated, L10 admin credentials compromised, system lockout engaged. "What the hell is Protocol 7? He asked his supervisor. Before the supervisor could answer, every screen in the room went black. They were replaced by a single stark white message on a black background. Ethereum Dynamics Network is in safe mode. All flight operations, data is quarantined pending security verification. Do not attempt reboot. This is not a malfunction." The phones began to ring, all of them, at once. JFK Tower was on line 1. "Dallas, we've lost all flight plan data for your inbound fleet." Heathrow on line 2. "Your ground crews are locked out of the baggage handling system." A pilot in the air over the Pacific on line 3. "Command, my Ethereum engine monitors just went dark. I'm flying blind here." The CEO of Global Voyager, a man named Gerald Vance, was in a board meeting when his assistant burst in, her face the color of ash. "Sir," she stammered, "we're grounded. The whole airline, Ethereum, it shut us down." Back in the Seattle airport substation, Sergeant Miller, a portly man 2 years from retirement, was enjoying a donut when the red phone on his desk shrieked. It was a direct line from the mayor's office. "Miller," he grunted into the receiver. "This is Mayor Thompson," a voice roared, so loud Miller flinched. "What in God's name is going on at your airport? I have the CEO of Global Voyager and the governor on my other line screaming that your officers just arrested the one person who can turn their airline back on. Do you have a Dr. Aris Thorne in custody?" Miller's blood ran cold. He looked over at Novak, who was writing up his report, looking pleased with himself. We have a Jane Doe, sir. Uncooperative, claimed she was some kind of CEO." "You monumental idiot," the mayor screamed. "That is Dr. Thorne. Her company's systems run half the infrastructure at that port. You get her out of that cell, you apologize, and you pray she doesn't decide to shut down the baggage carousels next." Miller dropped the phone. He stared at Novak with dawning horror. "What did you do?" At that exact moment, the main doors to the substation slid open. Benjamin Carter strode in, flanked by 2 imposing figures in sharp suits who were clearly not lawyers. Ben himself wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, but his eyes were burning with a cold fire Aris had only seen twice before. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sheer pressure of his presence silenced the room. "I am Benjamin Carter, General Counsel for Ethereum Dynamics," he announced, his voice like the closing of a bank vault door. "I am here for my client, Dr. Aris Thorne, whom your officers have illegally detained and assaulted. You have 10 seconds to produce her and the name of every officer involved before I launch a lawsuit so vast it will be measured in cubic acres of paperwork." Novak, his face now pale and sweaty, looked like he was about to be sick. Sergeant Miller fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit one in the lock. He threw open the door to Aris's cell. She was sitting on the bench, her posture erect, her expression unreadable. She looked up at the terrified sergeant. "Dr. Thorne," Miller stammered, his jowls trembling. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "No, Sergeant," Aris said, rising slowly to her feet, a wince crossing her face as her shoulder protested. "There was no misunderstanding. You understood perfectly. You saw a woman who didn't look like she belonged, and you treated her accordingly. The only thing you misunderstood was the consequences." Ben was at the door now. His professional fury melted away for a second, replaced by genuine concern. "Aris, are you okay? Your shoulder—" "Get me a doctor, Ben," she said, walking past the cowering officers without a second glance. "And then get me to a command terminal. It's time to open negotiations." As they walked through the precinct, she stopped in front of Officer Novak, who was trying to merge with the wall. She looked at him, her dark eyes seeing right through his bluster to the frightened man-child beneath. "You tore my rotator cuff, Officer Novak," she said quietly. "For that, I will own your career. I will own your pension, and every time you see an airplane in the sky, you will be reminded of the day you put your hands on the wrong woman." She walked out into the afternoon sun, where a black town car was waiting. Hospital first? Ben asked, climbing in beside her. No, Aris said, accepting the encrypted tablet he handed her. She logged in, her fingers flying across the screen with her good hand. The screen lit up with the Ethereum command interface. It showed a map of the world, dotted with over 1,000 blinking red icons, each one a grounded global Voyager aircraft. Take me to our Seattle data center. The airline wants to talk. Let's make sure we're speaking from a position of strength. Ben looked at the global map of paralyzed aviation. Aris, they're already grounded. What more can you do? Aris pulled up the master contract, Agreement 77B, the $7 billion deal that tethered Global Voyager to Ethereum Dynamics. She highlighted Clause 32, subsection C, the good faith and fair dealing clause, which gave Ethereum the right to suspend all services if the client engaged in actions that endangered Ethereum personnel or brought the company into public disrepute. She looked at Ben, a grim, terrifying smile touching her lips. Protocol 7 was an automatic safety measure. What comes next is a deliberate business decision. Her finger hovered over a command on the screen labeled, Initiate Asset Quarantine. I'm not just going to keep them grounded, Ben. I'm going to erase them from the sky. The Ethereum Dynamics Seattle data center was a temple of cold logic, a windowless cube of reinforced concrete and humming servers that managed trillions of data points every second. When Aris walked into the command center, still in her coveralls, her arm now in a hastily acquired sling, the 20 engineers at their stations rose as one. The video had been playing on a loop on the large central monitor. They saw her humiliation, her pain. Their faces were a mixture of fury and concern. Her chief systems architect, a brilliant young woman named Kenna Sharma, rushed to her side. Aris, we saw. Are you… I'm operational, Kenna. Aris cut her off, her voice all business. The pain was a roaring inferno in her shoulder, but she walled it off, compartmentalized it. There would be time for weakness later. Status report on the Protocol 7 lockout. It held perfectly, Kenna reported, pointing to the main screen. Global Voyager is completely dark. They have no access to flight plans, crew manifests, passenger data, fuel logs, nothing. Their entire operational nervous system is severed. They've been trying to bypass our firewalls for the last hour. It's cute. Good, Aris said. She strode to the primary command console. Ben followed, his face etched with worry. Aris, a word, he said, pulling her aside. Legally, we're on solid ground with the automatic lockout. It's a defensible safety protocol, but what you're talking about now, a deliberate quarantine, that's an act of war. They'll sue us into oblivion for breach of contract, for tortious interference. The damages will be astronomical. What's the penalty for them breaking the good faith clause? Aris asked, not taking her eyes off the screen. Technically, it allows for service suspension and financial penalties, but no one ever imagined a scenario like this, Aris finished for him. They didn't just assault a passenger, Ben. They assaulted the CEO of their most critical technology partner. They used their authority to create a security incident that, by our own internal logic, could have been a precursor to a corporate espionage attack. They broke the faith. Now they pay the penalty. She turned to Kenna. Is the asset quarantine protocol ready? Kenna hesitated. Aris, it's never been field tested. It's theoretical. If we execute it, it won't just lock them out. It will begin systematically erasing their temporary operational data from our servers. Every flight that was scheduled for the next 72 hours, every passenger record, every crew assignment, it will be wiped. It's not just turning off the lights, it's bulldozing the power station. They can't fly if they don't know who is supposed to be on what plane, Aris murmured, a chillingly calm expression on her face. Execute it, Kenna. Ben put a hand on her good arm. Aris, think about this. The passengers, the chaos. They should have thought about that before they put their hands on me, she countered, her voice hard as diamond. This isn't about revenge, Ben. It's about a lesson that will be written into the regulations of the entire industry. You do not mistake a woman for a liability. You do not mistake an engineer for an obstacle. And you do not assault your partners. Kenna, execute. Kenna took a deep breath. She trusted Aris implicitly. Aris had mentored her, championed her, believed in her when no one else would. If Aris said burn it down, Kenna would hand her the matches. She typed a long string of code into the console. The screen prompted for an authorization key. Aris leaned over the keyboard. With her left hand, she typed a single phrase, res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. Kenna hit enter. On the massive world map, the 1,000 blinking red icons of the grounded fleet didn't just stay red. They began to vanish, one by one, as if the planes themselves were being wiped from existence. In the Dallas headquarters of Global Voyager, CEO Gerald Vance was on a conference call with his board, trying to contain the panic. "We're working on it," he said, sweat beading on his forehead. "We believe it's a system glitch. Ethereum is not being cooperative." As he spoke, his COO burst into the room, holding a tablet, his face pale. He didn't speak, he just held up the tablet for Vance to see. It was an email from Benjamin Carter. Subject: Formal Notice of Service Suspension and Contractual Penalties. Mr. Vance, pursuant to Clause 32C of Agreement 77B, Ethereum Dynamics is hereby formally suspending all services to Global Voyager Airlines due to a gross violation of good faith, culminating in the physical assault and illegal detention of our Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Aris Thorne, by your personnel and associated authorities acting at your behest. Furthermore, we have initiated the Asset Quarantine Protocol to protect our intellectual property from what we can only assume is a compromised and hostile network environment. All operational data currently housed on our servers is being scrubbed. A formal demand for damages will follow. Vance read the words, and the floor seemed to drop out from under him. "Scrubbed," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What does that mean, scrubbed?" "It means," his COO said, his voice trembling, "that for the next 3 days, we don't have an airline. We have a billion-dollar collection of aluminum tubes sitting on tarmacs around the world." Meanwhile, on Flight 710, which had never left the gate in Seattle, the passengers were growing restless. Senator Alastair Finch was apoplectic. He had been on the phone for an hour, screaming at everyone from the Secretary of Transportation to his own Chief of Staff. "I don't care about some damned computer glitch," he bellowed into his phone, loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "Get this plane in the air. This is a matter of national security." Captain Mallory kept emerging from the cockpit, his face growing progressively grayer with each update. Finally, he came out and stood in the aisle, his hat in his hands. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a hoarse croak, "Global Voyager has ceased operations, indefinitely. We have been instructed that this aircraft will not be flying. Not today. Not tomorrow. We don't know when." The cabin erupted, but Senator Finch was silent. He was staring at his phone, not at his call log, but at his Twitter feed, which was a raging dumpster fire of his own making. The video of Aris being dragged off the plane was everywhere. His name was attached to it like a cancer. The comments were brutal. "Senator Finch abuses his power to assault a female engineer. Is this who we want running our country? Hey Arsene Finch, here Global Voyager is grounded. Hope your vote wasn't that important." Then he saw a new headline from the Wall Street Journal. "Ethereum Dynamics halts service to Global Voyager after CEO assaulted. Airline's future in doubt." The article contained a photo. It was a file photo of Dr. Aris Thorne accepting an award from the president for contributions to national security. She was wearing an elegant black dress, her hair impeccably styled, her expression one of quiet, formidable intelligence. Senator Finch stared at the photo, then at his memory of the woman in the dirty coveralls. The blood drained from his face. It was the same woman. He hadn't just slighted a mechanic. He had picked a fight with a titan of industry, a Pentagon darling, and the one person on Earth who held his airline's life in her hands. He slumped back in his seat, the phone slipping from his grasp. The vote on the Senate floor was forgotten. His career was flashing before his eyes. He had made a catastrophic error. And the woman he had wronged was about to send him the bill. By nightfall, the global transportation network was in chaos. The grounding of Global Voyager, one of the world's top 3 carriers, had created a domino effect. causing delays and cancellations across every competing airline as airports struggled to reallocate gate space and landing slots. News channels had abandoned all other stories. This was the only thing that mattered. The face of Dr. Aris Thorne was on every screen, juxtaposed with the footage of her being brutalized. She had become an overnight symbol of corporate power, racial prejudice, and epic calculated retribution. In the Ethereum Co., the command center at Ethereum Dynamics was not a war room, but it had acquired the grim electric tension of one. The air itself seemed to hum with the silent processing of a global crisis in motion. Aris sat at the head of a vast obsidian conference table, a lone figure of stillness in a whirlwind of controlled activity. A discreet medical team had come and gone, their diagnosis a litany of clinical brutalities. A full-thickness tear of the supraspinatus tendon, severe contusions, potential nerve damage. They had fitted her with a professional immobilizing sling, a black carapace that was somehow more damning than the makeshift one from before. It was a uniform of injury, a testament. She was running on a cocktail of shock, caffeine, and a fury so cold and pure it had crystallized in her veins, sharpening her thoughts to diamond points. The wall of monitors before her was a mosaic of the chaos she had unleashed. One screen showed the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, a sea of panicked gestures frozen in time next to the GVA ticker symbol, which had flatlined at a catastrophic 11.23 before trading was mercifully halted. Another displayed a live feed from CNN, a Chiron screaming, "Global shutdown, Airline grounded worldwide after CEO assaulted." A third cycled through heat maps of airport congestion, red blotches of paralysis spreading from LAX to Heathrow to Dubai. Billions in market capitalization, tens of thousands of travel plans, the intricate logistical ballet of a global economy. All of it had been vaporized in a single deliberate afternoon. Benjamin Carter was her second in command in this strange new war. He moved with a quiet intensity, a phone seemingly grafted to each ear as he parried and deflected the incoming salvos of a world demanding answers. "No, Mr. Secretary, Dr. Thorne is not available. Her statement will be released through official channels," he said into one phone, his voice a placid wall of granite. He gestured to an aide, who immediately began typing. Turning to the other phone, he was even more direct. "Mr. Vance, let me be unequivocally clear. Your access to Dr. Thorne is revoked. You had your opportunity to speak with her on Flight 710. You will now address your communications to my office." He ended both calls simultaneously and placed the phones on the table with a soft, definitive click. He looked at Aris, and for the first time, the lawyer's mask slipped, revealing the profound worry of a friend. They're in full-blown panic. The Department of Transportation is invoking national security clauses. The White House wants to mediate. Senator Finch's office is trying to spin this as an act of corporate terrorism, claiming you're holding the American economy hostage to settle a personal grudge. A ghost of a smile touched Aris's lips, a humorless, chilling thing. "He's not entirely wrong," she said, her voice a low murmur. She took a sip of the herbal tea Kenner had placed before her, the warmth a distant, inadequate comfort against the ice in her soul. "He is, however, mistaken about who took the hostage. He put a gun to the head of a system, assuming it was empty. I am merely showing him it was loaded." "And the ransom?" Ben pressed, leaning forward, his voice dropping. This was the heart of his concern. He was a man of contracts and clauses, of surgical legal strikes. What Aris had done was carpet bombing. "What is this, Aris? Truly, this goes beyond any precedent. This is biblical." Aris set her cup down and turned to face him, her dark eyes holding his. The physical pain in her shoulder was a hot, throbbing anchor, a constant reminder of the violation, of the moment her body was treated as an object to be manhandled and broken. It was a fuel source. This was never about a seat on an airplane, Ben, or my shoulder, or even my pride. It was about an assumption so deeply embedded in the structure of our world that it's invisible to the people who benefit from it. The pilot, the flight attendant, the senator. They looked at me and they didn't see an engineer, or a CEO, or a human being with agency. They saw a woman out of place in dirty clothes. They saw a problem to be removed, not a person to be heard. They assumed I was powerless. They assumed my appearance was the final word on my value. They assumed they could inflict pain and humiliation without consequence. She rose, the movement stiff and deliberate, and walked towards the main screen, her shadow falling across the frantic news reports. Her team of engineers and analysts watched her, their expressions a mixture of awe and trepidation. They had built the weapon, but she alone had pulled the trigger. "The ransom," she said, her voice resonating with a terrible clarity, "is the utter annihilation of that assumption. We are going to create a consequence so monumental, so unforgettable, that it will be etched into the corporate DNA of every company in this country. The next time a man in a position of power looks at a woman he deems lesser, I want a flicker of this day to cross his mind. I want him to hesitate. I want him to feel a cold knot of fear in his stomach. I want him to ask himself, is this another Aris Thorne? That is the ransom." She turned back to her team, her focus absolute. "I want everything, a full forensic accounting of Senator Finch's entire life. His campaign donors, his offshore accounts, his voting record cross-referenced with his stock portfolio. I want every FAA complaint ever filed against Captain Mallory, every black box recording from every turbulent flight he's ever captained. I want a psychological profile of every member of Global Voyager's board of directors, their pressure points, their vanities, their debts. They believed this was a fleeting moment of unpleasantness. We are going to prove to them that it is the defining event of their lives." The next 24 hours were a masterclass in focused fury. While the world reeled, Ethereum dynamics became a sealed vault of information warfare. Data miners unearthed buried scandals. Legal eagles drafted documents that were less contracts and more instruments of surrender. And a quiet but devastating media campaign fed select pieces of information to trusted journalists, shaping the public narrative with surgical precision. The story was no longer just about an assault on a plane. It was about a systemic culture of arrogance and corruption, with Senator Finch and Global Voyager at its rotten core. The hashtag, The Thorne Effect, had gone viral, a rallying cry for millions who had felt dismissed and devalued. It was no longer her story, it was theirs. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. Not on neutral ground, but in her domain. The Ethereum boardroom was a cathedral of quiet power. A long polished table of black granite overlooking the Seattle skyline through a wall of seamless glass. It was a room designed to make visitors feel small and exposed. Aris sat at its head, her arm in the black sling, a stark emblem of the conflict. It was not a sign of weakness, but an accusation made flesh. Ben sat to her right, his calm demeanor belying the mountain of legal weaponry stacked neatly before him. The heavy glass doors slid open and the delegation of the vanquished entered. Gerald Vance, the CEO of Global Voyager, seemed to have shrunk. His expensive suit hung on him like a shroud, his face a pasty mask of sleepless dread. He was flanked by a phalanx of lawyers whose expressions were a mixture of aggression and sheer terror. Trailing them, a man untethered from his own reality, was Senator Alistair Finch. The swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle, coached contrition. He looked not at Aris, but at the floor, as if he might fall through it. "Dr. Thorne," Vance began, his voice a dry rasp, "on behalf of every employee and shareholder of Global Voyager Airlines, I wish to express our most profound, unequivocal, and sincere—" "Stop," Aris said. The word was not loud, but it cleaved through his rehearsed speech like a razor. "Sincerity requires a capacity for shame, Mr. Vance, a quality your organization has proven it lacks. Your apologies are a worthless currency in this room. We will speak of assets that still retain some value. Mr. Carter, please enlighten our guests." Ben stood, the picture of professional calm. "Gentlemen, we have prepared a term sheet for the conditional restoration of Ethereum services. I must stress that these terms are not a starting point for negotiation. They are the price of survival." An aide, moving with silent efficiency, placed a thick, leather-bound binder in front of Global Voyager's lead counsel. The man, a notoriously pugnacious litigator from a top DC firm, opened it. His jaw tightened, his face paled. He flipped a page, then another, his breathing growing shallow. This is extortion," he finally sputtered, looking up at Aris with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You're demanding a 51% controlling interest in the company. A complete transfer of all voting stock to Ethereum for the symbolic sum of $1. This is corporate piracy." Ben didn't flinch. "Your company, as of this moment, is an empty shell with a book value trending towards zero. Its only remaining asset is its contractual relationship with us. We are not seizing a viable entity, we are offering to salvage a wreck. In exchange for this salvage operation, Dr. Thorne will assume control. She will personally appoint a new vetted board of directors and a new chief executive officer." Vance made a soft, choking sound and sank into his chair. "Furthermore," Ben continued, his voice a relentless, dispassionate metronome, "Global Voyager will provide the initial endowment for a new non-profit foundation to be administered by Ethereum. It will be called the Thorne Initiative for Equity in STEM. The endowment will be $500 million, funded by the liquidation of non-essential corporate assets and the entirety of the executive bonus pool for the next 10 years. Its mission will be to create a generation of engineers and scientists from underrepresented communities, ensuring that the minds that build the future look like the world the future is meant for." Aris watched them, her face an unreadable mask. This was not about profit. It was about consequence. She was seizing the engine of her humiliation and retrofitting it to power a new world, one where a young woman who looked like her would never have to endure this. Then her gaze shifted, landing on Senator Finch with the weight of a physical blow. He flinched. "And now for you, Senator," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. Ben slid a single sheet of heavy bond paper across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Finch. It was a letter of resignation, addressed to the President of the Senate. "You will sign that letter," Aris commanded. "You will resign your seat in the United States Senate, effective immediately. Your official statement will cite pressing personal health concerns. You will not give a farewell address. You will not speak to the press. You will vanish from public life. Should you refuse or hesitate or attempt to fight this, the dossier my team has compiled on your financial arrangements with certain defense contractors, the ones you oversaw on the Aviation Subcommittee, will be messengered to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the New York Times by 5 o'clock this evening." Finch stared at the letter, his face ashen. He looked at Aris, searching for a bluff, for a crack in her resolve. He found nothing but the cold, hard certainty of a woman who had seen the abyss and had decided to make it her own. "You can't," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "This is blackmail. It's a felony." "No, Senator," Aris corrected him, her voice silk and steel. "Blackmail is a threat made for personal enrichment. This is a public service. You built a political career on the bedrock of personal responsibility and the rule of law. I am simply holding you to your own standard. It is time for you to take responsibility for your actions." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the frantic whispered consultations between Vance and his lawyers. Finch sat paralyzed, the letter before him a death warrant for the only life he had ever known. He had spent decades accumulating power, only to have it dismantled in minutes by a woman he had dismissed as a piece of grit. Finally, Vance looked up, his eyes hollowed out, defeated. "We agree," he said, the words a surrender. "Global Voyager agrees to the terms." All eyes turned to Finch. With a trembling hand, he reached for the sterling silver pen on the table. The scratching sound of the nib on the paper was deafeningly loud. He signed his name, the familiar flourish of his signature, now a crooked, broken thing. He had just erased himself from history. "Two final points," Aris said, her voice sharp, cutting through the haze of their defeat. "Captain Mallory and Flight Attendant Kyle, their employment is terminated, effective immediately. Their FAA certifications are to be submitted for a full review based on professional misconduct and endangerment of passengers. And a formal public apology will be issued by the airline, not to me, to every passenger on Flight 710 for the captain's dereliction of duty in ignoring a credible engineering warning from a subject matter expert." Vance nodded numbly. "It will be done." "Excellent," Aris said, pushing her chair back and rising to her feet. My integration team will be in touch to begin the transition. Service will be restored in phases as we see fit. Now get out of my boardroom." They left not as men, but as ghosts, their power and prestige flensed from them. When the doors slid shut, Ben let out a long, slow breath. He looked at Aris, his expression one of pure, unadulterated awe. "Aris, you didn't just defeat them. You dismantled them. You took apart their entire world, piece by piece." Aris walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights beginning to glitter in the twilight. The ache in her shoulder was a deep, persistent throb, a permanent echo of the price of this victory. "It wasn't a dismantling, Ben," she said softly, watching the distant, orderly lights of other airplanes tracing their paths across the darkening sky. "It was a recalibration. 6 months later, the world had absorbed the shockwave. The airline, reborn as Global Voyager United, was slowly rebuilding its reputation under a new CEO, a sharp, experienced woman Aris had promoted from the ranks of their own logistics division. The GVU logo now featured a small stylized wing over the U, a subtle nod to the protection and oversight of Ethereum. The Thorn Initiative was a sensation, a beacon of hope in the tech world, its first class of scholarship recipients already making headlines. Alistair Finch was a ghost, his name a political trivia question. Officer Novak was awaiting trial, his career a smoldering ruin. Captain Mallory was teaching at a community college flight simulator program, permanently grounded. Aris stood on a windswept bluff overlooking the Puget Sound, the site of the future Ethereum Aerospace Academy, the centerpiece of her initiative. The wind was cold, and she instinctively touched her shoulder. The surgery had been successful, but the surgeons had told her she would always feel the changes in the weather. A permanent barometer of injustice. Beside her stood a young woman, a 16-year-old named Maya, the Academy's first honorary fellow whose award-winning drone design had captivated Aris. "I've read every article about what you did, Dr. Thorne," Maya said, her eyes, bright with a fierce intelligence, fixed on Aris's face. "They say you waged a war against the whole system." Aris watched a GV United Dreamliner ascend gracefully from the nearby airport, its wings catching the last rays of the setting sun. The bitterness that had fueled her for weeks had finally burned away, leaving behind not emptiness but a heavy tempered resolve. "A system isn't a fortress, Maya," Aris said, her voice quiet against the wind. "It's a network of choices. 1,000,000 people choosing to look the other way, to accept the unacceptable, to maintain the status quo. I didn't wage a war, I just made a choice of my own. A choice so loud, so disruptive, that it forced everyone else in the network to stop and make a new one." She looked from the ascending plane to the young, hopeful face beside her, a face that represented the future she was now building. She hadn't just fought for her seat on the plane. She had seized the cockpit, rewritten the flight plan, and in doing so had altered the very atmosphere in which they all flew.